that we can actually just be ahead of schedule and move on to our next speaker, who is Charlie Endris from my own Elkhorn Slough Reserve.
All right, thanks, Kirstine. Let's go. Okay, I'm going to be talking about our race against rising water levels, marsh restoration and monitoring in Elkhorn Slough, California. Over here on the right, you can see the map of Elkhorn Slough here at the head of the Monterey Bay Submarine Canyon, right in the central part of Monterey Bay. And in the foreground image here is our Hester restoration site that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. And that's right about in this area of the slide right there. So Elkhorn Slough, although it's surrounded by quite a bit of conservation land, it is what we consider a working landscape. There's a lot of agriculture surrounding Elkhorn Slough, as well as some industry, such as a power plant up at the head of the marsh. But it is home to hundreds of species of marine birds and mammals and fish and such. But it is under threat from a lack of sediment supply, sea level rise, subsidence, eutrophication, all these different factors that many of us are familiar with. And then it's also gone through quite a history of hydrologic modifications in the past. So that's all of that is leading to this marsh drowning and bank erosion that we've been seeing in Elkhorn. So in the early 2000s, my predecessor, Eric Van Dyke and Kirstine Wasson did a beautiful study pulling together hundreds of different images, aerial images, and maps to show the evolution of Elkhorn Slough since the 1800s. And what they found is primarily through these hydrologic modifications over time, such as the railroad that went in on the eastern side, as well as changes in the position of the harbor mouth to opening up to Monterey Bay. These have led to major losses in salt marsh habitat that you can see in green here. And they've transitioned into more of a salt marsh and mud habitat. Just a quick example, up here in this northern part where you see this dense, nice pickleweed marsh in the 1930s that has now transitioned to mostly mudflat there. So Eric was a real pioneer kind of early on in the 2000s in terms of focusing on a vertical control network and using other instruments such as water quality sondes and surface elevation tables that we can then use to monitor our water levels with respect to our marsh elevations. And a lot of this work went into that early period of the Sentinel Sites program that many of you are familiar with. Now, he also found during this time that Elkhorn Slough's marshes are particularly low in the tidal frame, meaning that once you get above mean high water, we don't have a lot of acreage. This is a histogram of our acreage, of our elevations in Elkhorn. Above about 1.7, 1.75, we don't have available acreage for the salt marsh to be growing vegetation. Even though in the areas where it exists, we can see that pickleweed does quite well. This is a health index on the y-axis. We just don't have that acreage. So this was an alarming discovery for us. It's particularly alarming when you look at the past 10 years of water levels relative to the mean sea level, the historic mean sea level in Elkhorn Slough. We can see that they're quite elevated above what they were before 2014. We can also look at the sea level rise rate. This comes from the Monterey Tide Station here. And how well it appears to match with the elevation rate that we're getting from our surface elevation tables that were placed throughout the slough back in the 2006. They appear to match quite well, but if you look at this sea level rise rate in the last 16 years, you can see that it's really exceeding what our marsh elevation gain is. And that's true also if you look at our accretion rate. It's far outpacing what our elevation gain is showing here. So we know based on this that there's quite a bit of subsidence and compaction that's happening deeper down in the marsh. If we also look at the California sea level scenarios that are projected out for the next 100 years or more, it's pretty alarming. And so I took these water levels and then did some modeling to try to project what our salt marsh vegetation habitat is going to look like in the coming years. And it appears that in 35 years, we could very well lose about 50% of our marsh. So we're working with kind of in a race, really. And unfortunately, we don't have the space for marsh to migrate into. And you can see that based on this imagery with the hillshade underneath that just shows just topographically how steep it is surrounding Elkhorn. So enter in our restoration site here. These were kind of the lead up to this restoration project. So beginning in the 1930s, you can see we had a nice, healthy pickleweed marsh there. By the 40s and then into the 60s, you can see how much modification was taking place. These dikes and levees were going in. This whole area was diked and drained, which really subsided that whole marsh elevation to levels that were well below what could sustain pickleweed marsh by the time the tides were entered back into this area. So we can look at that on a DEM, and we can see that the low marsh and the high marsh is nearly non-existent here in the Hester site. In the natural marsh over here in the northeast, you can only see just little bits of fringe of high marsh in those zones. So we essentially took about 360,000 cubic yards from this adjacent hillside, and we pushed it into the marsh, creating a high marsh elevation of about 1.95 meters. And that's right now what we're continuing to monitor. This was done back in 2018, another phase in 2021. And you can see now we have this nice high marsh elevation for the water levels to migrate into. So we're using GPS, remote sensing, and field measurements, obviously, to do this work. We've really also begun to rely on drones for the broad scale mapping and for elevation models and for automated classifications as well. But we still do use our kind of old standard field techniques. And just to wrap up here, what we're showing, this is kind of like the histograms I was showing earlier, but just turned on the side. These were the previous elevations we had in Elkhorn Slough. And now with the restoration, we have some higher elevations for our marsh to migrate into. But we still have a lot of work to do. There's a massive amount of land, about 900 acres that are well below what the elevation levels that we'd like to see for the marsh to sustain itself. So identifying funding and different projects for this area is our next goal moving forward. So just to wrap up, Esner helped pioneer that Sentinel Sites program long ago, and we're using the sets, the sea level rise monitoring, and the marsh elevations, which are vital to informing our restoration design. And then we're using drones and other technological advancements for that restoration monitoring. And sadly, yeah, without restoration, the future of Elkhorn marshes is pretty worrisome for us. That's it.
Thank you, Charlie. And we do have time for a question if somebody wants to type one in the chat or unmute themselves. Doug, go for it.
Thanks, Christine. Charles, I'm excited to see well, I'll say it this way. I'm sad to see that there's such a huge space still needing sediment for movement. And I'm curious, you said looking for funding. What kind of material availability is there in the region that could help move the marsh plains in the positive direction?
Availability in terms of sediment, I think you might mean. We do have some upland in the surrounding areas that are owned and managed by the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. So we've looked into a partnership with them of excavating some former farmed lands where we had a lot of accretion from those steep hillsides. The sediment has come down into some sediment basins, but it's still not nearly enough volume that we require to fill a lot of that space. So we're looking into other potential methods. Another one is these deep level, I can't remember the name, but it's basically injecting fluids and other materials to raise a marsh plain from deep below. So these are all kind of new pioneer methods that we're just kind of investigating now, but it's a tall order, without a doubt.
Okay, well, I must have really terrified the speakers with my threats about cutting them off at 8 minutes and all, because everybody's staying very on time. But yeah, I'm very proud to have two Elkhorn speakers in a row. I think I really became a true believer in the value of wetlands and water levels by these really concrete examples that Eric Van Dyke kept telling us you need to know where your marsh sits in the tidal frame. And when we discovered how low our marshes were at Elkhorn, that's why we did restoration and how we did it. And working closely with Virginia on education and outreach, shows a totally different dimension of the value of this project.